All right, welcome to another edition of History at the Creek. Today's topic is Marbury versus Madison. We want to make Marbury versus Madison a little more than just judicial review. And we're here with Assistant Principal Eric Schwarzenegger. He is also a Marbury versus Madison expert, and so he's going to tell us a lot more about it. First off, why did Marbury sue Madison in the first place?
Yeah, so Marbury was a Federalist, and you have to understand in 1800 the Federalists get their butts whooped in the election of 1800 by Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. So they lose the presidency, they lose the House and the Senate, and they're just wiped clean. Well, as you know, there's a third branch of government, that's the judicial branch. And if you look at the Constitution, there's no term limits when it comes to the judicial branch.
Right.
So John Adams, the president, before he leaves office, and the Federalists in Congress realize, if we're going to stay relevant, we've lost all these elections. If we're going to stay relevant, we got to infiltrate the judicial branch and become judges so that we can at least be a part of this government. So what happens is John Adams appoints, really at the last hour, a bunch of judges.
Midnight judges.
Right, the midnight judges you learn about in class. John Marshall actually happens to be one of them. John Marshall is a player that we'll talk about in a second. He ends up being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marbury is a Federalist, and John Adams appoints him to be a small-time judge in the District of Columbia, not a major position in any way. So what happens is, again, this is the last hour. I mean, literally the last hour of John Adams' presidency.
And he's a Federalist. He's going to put a lot of Federalists in power.
Yep, so he's signing all these appointments, and Marbury is one of them. They deliver these appointments to the Department of State, the State Department, which was the process at the time. And John Marshall is actually the Secretary of State at the time. His job was to sign off of them and deliver them, and they don't get delivered before the presidency ends.
Okay.
Next day happens, Jefferson gets inaugurated as president, third president of the United States. Madison is his Secretary of State, James Madison, is his Secretary of State at the time, shows up at the office, and he sees on his desk a number of judicial appointments.
Okay.
Madison goes to his president, Jefferson, and says, listen, I got all these appointments. They're all Federalists. What do I do with them? And Jefferson says, nothing. Just leave them. We're not going to appoint them. They're not our people. Why
the
would
papers just sat there in the filing cabinet.
Right, basically, yeah. They just sit there unattended. We're not going to appoint them. Marbury knows this. Right? Marbury knows that he was promised a job. He doesn't get the job. He knows that Madison has this paper that says he should be this judge in D.C., and he goes to Marbury and says, Marbury goes to Madison and says, give me the job. Madison says, not going to happen.
Okay.
So, if you have a dispute with somebody, what do? Well, you go to the courts. So, at the time, there was a Judicial Act of 1789, that said if a corrective action needs to be made in the federal government, you go to the Supreme Court. So that's what Marbury does. He sues Madison in the Supreme Court, basically saying, Madison needs to hand over these papers so I can get my job. And that's why he sues Madison.
And it's just, they're both Federalists. Am I wrong in saying that? Aren't Marbury and Madison both Federalists?
Yeah, so at the time, right, we think of Madison as a Federalist because we think of him as the father of the Constitution and wanted a stronger federal government over
Federalist
the
Papers.
Articles. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But at the time, the division was as such that Madison sides with Jefferson, a fellow Virginian, feels that there's been too much power concentrated in the North and in the businesses, so he sides with, they're no longer part of the same party, so to speak. Okay, so they are separate at this point.
So Adams and Marbury are a different brand of Federalists, you're telling me, than Madison was at this point.
Yeah.
He's more on Jefferson's side.
Correct. Yep.
So there's a lot of parties in this suit.
Yeah.
Who would you say won and who lost? I mean, that's kind of a
yeah.
It's I usually just teach judicial review because I, being honest, get confused myself.
Yeah.
Who won and who lost in Marbury versus Madison?
Yeah, so on the surface, this is a pretty narrow case. This is about one guy who didn't get his job and is suing the Secretary of State to say, give me my job.
Okay.
So why in the world would we teach this in our civics class and our American history
Never
classes?
miss
And
it.
you're
We
right.
teach it all. I mean, we
Right.
always,
We always teach it. It's foundational. And it's because of what comes out of this is judicial review. So if you look at it this way, right, one side sues the other. Either Madison wins or Marbury wins. Well, here's the thing. John Marshall gets to be appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Marshall is a Federalist. Now, yes, Marbury and Madison are the two names in this court case, but in honesty, they're kind of minor players. Really, the major players are John Marshall, the Federalist Chief Justice,
Right.
and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican president. They're the two chief players here. It's kind of like a proxy war, you
So
know?
now that it's Jefferson,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and Marshall, who wins?
So here's what happens. The Supreme Court says, well, you know, I kind of have to go back a little bit. Marbury is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wants, Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. It's a lot of M's here. Marshall, the Chief Justice, wants Marbury to win. They're both Federalists, they're the same brand of federalism. Marshall knows that Marbury was done wrong. He should get this job.
And he can't make that happen?
Well, he could issue, it's called a writ of mandamus. He could issue that to say, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, give this man his job.
Okay.
The Supreme Court doesn't have an army; they can't force it.
Right.
But they can say you need to give him this job.
Yeah.
The court has the right, the authority to tell another part of the government to do something.
Right.
That's why Marbury goes to the Supreme Court. But here's the thing: Marshall knows that if he tells Jefferson to give Marbury his job, he knows that Jefferson's not going to do it. And it's just so early on in the country's history
Right.
that if the Supreme Court tells the president to do something and the president says, nope, well, that sets the precedent.
Yeah.
For now on, whenever the Supreme Court tells the president to do something, the president can just say no.
Yeah. So it's not an equal branch yet.
Well, it's not an equal branch. So Marshall knows that if he tells Jefferson to give him the job, he's not going to win in the long run because Jefferson's going to ignore him and the Supreme Court's basically going to be meaningless.
Okay.
If he rules in the favor of Madison, well, now he's siding with the party that he's against, and he's siding for the wrong ruling. So Marshall's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's a lose-lose situation for him. And the thing that's so fascinating about this case is that John Marshall comes out winning. There's a third option that he essentially invents, and that third option is judicial review. If you read the opinion, the opinion of the Supreme Court starts out by saying, Marbury, you should get your job. Madison and Jefferson have wronged you. They've done something that is illegal.
Right.
You should get your job, right? No question about it. However, right, so Marbury is feeling really good about himself, like, hey, I just won this case. However, you've come to the wrong place. The Supreme Court, although we feel you should get your job and you've been wronged,
Right.
the Supreme Court really doesn't have the authority to issue a directive for the president to give you that job.
Right.
In the Constitution, we don't have that power to tell another part of the government what to do.
And at the same time, Congress doesn't have the authority, right?
Yeah. So here's the thing. So why does Marbury think that the Supreme Court has the ability to hear this case? Because the Judicial Act passed by Congress and signed by President Washington said that the Supreme Court has this power. Here's John Marshall saying, nope, we don't have that power. That law that gives me the power to tell the president to do something is unconstitutional. It goes against the Constitution.
Yeah.
So
because it's not Congress's job.
I mean, well, here's the thing. I mean, it could or couldn't be declared unconstitutional. The thing is, this is the only way out for Marshall.
Right.
And now it puts Jefferson in a bad spot. So basically, you asked me who won. Marbury technically loses. Right? He loses the battle, but Marshall is able to win the greater war of federal power, the power for the Supreme Court, power for the judicial branch. He gives the court, in doing so, he gives the court the power of judicial review, the power to look at a law and decide, is it in tune, is it in line with the Constitution or not? Think of it like the umpire of a baseball game, right? We think of the Supreme Court today as the umpire. They get to call the strikes, the fouls, right, the safes, the outs.
Right. That's a good. I've never thought about it like that. I like that.
There's nothing in the Supreme Court, in the Constitution, that says the Supreme Court can make those decisions.
Right.
John Marshall said we get to make those decisions in this case. He invents the only real power the Supreme Court has out of this case. Think of it from Jefferson's point of view.
Yeah.
So here's Jefferson.
Yeah.
Well, on the surface, he wins this case. Marbury lost, so Jefferson wins.
Yeah.
Madison and Jefferson win. He has to accept the power of judicial review, because if he doesn't accept it, he's saying, oh, Marbury should get his job. He can't do that. So Jefferson's stuck. He has to accept the ruling,
Yeah.
and the court has just given itself its most significant power it has ever had.
And one other player we've forgotten, and I'm just interested in hear your perspective of this. Does that mean Adams is definitely a loser? Is there any way that Adams wins anything with this? I mean, he's former president. He's no longer president. His appointments, this is his last Federalist hurrah. And now...
Yeah, here's the thing. I think, one of John Adams' greatest contributions as a president is the appointment of John Marshall to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Because without John Marshall, there really is no Supreme Court as we know it today. He's the one who not only decides this case, but he also decides a whole bunch of other cases establishing the supremacy of the federal government over the state government.
Right.
We tend to think of John Adams as this loser president because he only won one term, et cetera, et cetera. But when you go back and look at it, there's really a whole lot of good things he did following Washington to set up our government. A lot of negative things he did as well, and
Right.
Alien Sedition Acts come to mind, of course.
That's probably why we don't
Yeah.
hear more about him, because of
Right.
Alien and Sedition Act.
Certainly one of the more underappreciated presidents in my book. I think John Adams at this point is kind of happy to be out of the game, but John Adams, at this point, he's kind of I feel like a puppet for the Federalist Party by the end of his lame duck presidency, that he's just trying to get Federalists in power, and John Marshall happened to be the best one he could possibly pick.
And then, did they use this power a lot? Did the Marshall Court use judicial review?
Ironically, they don't use it. The Marshall Court doesn't use it. And John Marshall is a Chief Justice for a long time, almost 30 years, I think. And he actually never ends up using judicial review again. But further down the line, of course, the Supreme Court does hear it. And, I mean, without Marbury versus Madison, without judicial review, there is no Brown versus Board of Education, right? There is no... Texas versus Johnson, freedom of speech, right? All of these laws that the Supreme Court have said are unconstitutional. They don't have the ability to do it without this court case. The Congress is set up the way it is because of Article 1, right? The presidency, the powers it has, and the way it's set up is set up because of Article 2. The power the Supreme Court has is not because of Article 3, it's because of this court case.
Right.
And that's the lasting impact. And that's why we always say, Marbury versus Madison, judicial review. But the fact of the matter is, it's amazing how Marshall is able to make this opinion turn into something greater than it would seem on the surface.
Well, Mr. Schwarzenegger, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And please come back again on History at the Creek. We've enjoyed talking with you.
All right, Scott, I appreciate it.
All
My name
right.
is Mr. Swindler.
All right.